So up next, we have Dr. Arsenio Paez, who is a clinical trialist with a focus on complex interventions in sleep, surgery, and rehabilitation. His research in the sleep cognition and neuroimaging lab at Concordia University in Montreal investigates the effect of physical activity on sleep. He's going to talk a little bit about that today. So welcome, Dr. Paez.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I wish I was there, but I'm delighted to be here in the way that I can be. And I also have some handouts, some PDFs that you'll be able to access on the app. And importantly, let me share my screen. I would like to speak to you today about the importance of sleep and physical activity, especially for our many of our loved ones and heroes with copy number variant genetic disorders. And I promise you, by the time we're done, I will have cured your own insomnia. But hopefully, we can all make it to the end of the presentation together. Let me just put myself onto presentation view, and we can take it from there. So it's one of those interesting things. The number of times that I have thought I've got this totally settled, and then the computer crashes. Hopefully, we won't have anything like that. So we're going to talk again about night and day, about sleep and physical activity and how they can influence health and well-being. And why night and day? Why do we talk about this? Well, we're going to talk about daytime activity being physical activity, nighttime activity being sleep. Both of them have a really large impact on health, on mental health, on quality of life. Both can be difficult for our loved ones with copy number variant disorders. And we see that physical activity improves sleep, and that sleep improves physical activity. They're very well related. That both really greatly influence cognition, mental health, quality of life, both separately and together. And I think they tend to be overlooked, unfortunately, especially when we talk about the health and well-being of our loved ones with either CNV or neurodevelopmental disorders. So interestingly, what is sleep? If you ask someone what sleep is, half the time they'll say, well, it's when I'm not awake. But it's more complex than that. It's a very dynamic state, actually. It only looks quiet. It's actually very active. Your brain is buzzing with activity while you're sleeping. It's where we archive our memories. All the things that we experience and we learn during the day get filed away and archived and made meaningful during sleep. It's also where we dream, and importantly, it's a survival mechanism. How does it work? Well, we don't just shut our eyes and off we go. We actually have 4 different stages of sleep. In the first stage of sleep, this is when we're transitioning between being awake and being asleep. It's usually about the first 10 minutes. It's our light sleep. This is often the time where you might sort of doze off and experience a sleep jerk, or swear you hear someone calling your name. It's a very common experience at that stage of sleep. Then we go off to a second stage of sleep where your body temperature drops, our heart rate begins to slow, we're becoming much more relaxed. The brain is beginning to produce these waves called sleep spindles that we'll talk about later. It lasts about 20 minutes or so. It actually makes up sometimes about 50% of your night's sleep, because we cycle through these over the course of a night. Then we go off to stage 3 sleep, and this is a very important stage of sleep. Our muscles have really relaxed now. We're in a very deep sleep. Our blood pressure has begun to dip. Our breathing has begun to really slow down. It's the deepest sleep we get, but importantly, this is where we tend to do a lot of consolidating of memory, a lot of things that we've learned, a lot of things we're trying to remember. This is where they get put away and they get filed away, and this is where they get processed. Interestingly, this is also the stage where we tend to have a lot of sleepwalking. Bedwetting often tends to happen at this stage of sleep. And then finally, we shift off to REM sleep. And that's a phrase I think a lot of people have heard, rapid eye movement sleep. This is where your brain is really, really sometimes the most active. Interestingly, your body becomes semi-paralyzed at this stage. Your brain shuts your body down, because this is also where we dream. And your brain is so vivid and so active that unless your body had been shut down, there's always a possibility your brain would be convinced that you really do have to run down the corridor and run into a wall or enact what you're dreaming. And it's in a stage also where a lot of very important cognitive processes take place. What's interesting about sleep is that we don't just do 1, 2, 3, 4 and wake up. We go through these 1, 2, 3, 4, back to 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we cycle through these at night, and disturbances, things that keep us awake, things that make it hard for us to stay asleep, can have an enormous impact on our health because of that. Well, what makes us sleep? And of course, this will seem like a no-brainer. You might say, well, duh, exhaustion. Well, yes, that's true. Exhaustion does make us sleep, but we also have an internal drive to sleep. Our body is programmed to get us to the point that we will fall asleep near the end of the day. We also have neurotransmitters, these chemicals in your brain and hormones that help us sleep. Example, melatonin. And we'll talk about melatonin more later. Melatonin doesn't actually put you to sleep. Melatonin just creates the sort of the restful conditions that allow you to drift to sleep. We also have an internal biological clock, these circadian rhythms. It's your sleep-wake cycle. And we've got clock genes, believe it or not, in your brain. These are genes and these are parts of the brain that they keep your internal clock and they tell your body what to do at what time. So for example, your blood pressure tends to rise over the course of the morning to get you ready for what you're going to meet during the day. So it's maybe one of the reasons that we tend to see more strokes and heart attacks earlier in the morning, for example. Your body starts preparing your digestive proteins when it knows that you're about to eat, when you tend to eat at the same time every day. Melatonin, for example, that it tends to get you ready for sleep, tends to rise later in the evening. Also environmental cues. Our brains are extremely sensitive to light, and we're going to talk about this one over and over again because this is an important one. Our brains are so sensitive to light that it helps to reset our internal clock. And I pick on the iPad, and we'll talk about why, how the iPad or the light that we get from our eye devices actually might be making it more difficult for us or our children or our loved ones to fall asleep. And any number of other things can influence our sleep. Exercise, temperature. It's very hard to sleep in a room that's too warm, for example. Social activity throughout the day. So, okay, I bored you with all these components of sleep, but why is this important? Well, it's essential for maintaining health. There is not a single type of tissue or system in the body that does not in some way depend on sleep. It's important for us to maintain our energy, to maintain body processes. Vital brain functions depend on it. Our neurons communicate. The brain cleans up, so to speak, and removes toxins from its activities during sleep. And importantly, again, learning and memory and emotions, all the things that we put into the filing cabinet and go to pull out later, a lot of those depend on sleep. Even one night of poor sleep, you can see the results the next day in your cognitive performance. So poor and disrupted sleep, again, it has an enormous impact on cognition, on learning, on memory. It increases your risk of a range of disorders, everything from high blood pressure, heart attacks, diabetes, depression. A lot of mental health disorders are linked to poor sleep, obesity, dementia, and generally reduced quality of life. And one of the things that we may see the most with our young adults and children and loved ones who have a developmental issue is that it really can reduce their participation, their ability to get out in the world and do the things that they really want to do. And it's also linked to physical inactivity, to sedentariness. And it creates a bit of a vicious circle. People who tend to sleep less tend to move less during the day. People who tend to move less during the day tend to have more difficulty sleeping. And it can create this vicious circle that's very difficult to get out of. So how big is this a problem? Is this something to really be concerned about? It actually is. For the World Health Organization, poor sleep is considered a global health crisis. Usually we think of global health crises, we think of things like obesity or dementia, but poor sleep is one of them as well. Up to 30% of adults in the general population across the planet have poor sleep. And this is up to 60% of Americans. Importantly for us, it could be all the way from half to 95% of children and young adults with developmental disorders, up to 3/4 of the persons with autism spectrum disorders, or even half of persons with ADHD. Your average school-age child plucked from anywhere in the US, up to 30% of them may have poor sleep or sleep difficulties. And these can actually predict major depression, poor executive function and academic skills later in childhood and even into adulthood. But what about our heroes, our persons with CNV disorders? Well, we know from other disorders, for example, 22q, that 60% of them report sleeping difficulties or sleep disorders between the ages of 6 and 17. What about AP, for example? Up to 40% of persons with AP may have sleep disorders. What about others in our community? 15q, ring 14, it's something we really have to look at much more in depth. And it's not just our loved ones, it's also parents, all of us, parents of children or young adults who have poor sleep also report poor sleep, and that won't surprise you, I imagine. But they also report higher rates of depression, increased stress, and that these sleep issues, their own and their loved ones, really interfere with daily life and can really strain family function. As a matter of fact, it's among persons who have neurodevelopmental disorders, the prevalence of sleep disorders is so high that it's now been recommended that all persons, all children with neurodevelopmental disorders should be screened for sleep problems at least once. So how long should we sleep? And this is a bit of a moving target in some ways, because what we see is that over the lifespan, we tend to need less sleep than we do when we're younger. So, infants might need anywhere between 14 to 17 hours of sleep. And as you get older, it drops from 12 to 15 to 11 to 14. By the time that most kids are, in school age, between 3 and 5 years of age, you're really looking for 10 to 13 as the recommended amount. And anything between 9 and 14 hours is, relatively okay. And your adult years, you start now, that declines a bit, and you need maybe 7 to 9 hours of sleep, excuse me. And that remains pretty stable. One thing we see is that as we get older, we need slightly less sleep. Sleep changes a lot throughout the course of a lifetime. So that sounds great. But what do we actually see? Especially, let's take teenagers, adolescents. I call these the vampire years. My nephew and niece, for example, they do sleep, but only in daylight. They never, only at night. I think they never see the sunrise. Teenagers tend to need about 9 hours of sleep for optimal health, for emotional well-being, for cognitive function. But what we see with them is that they often experience what's called a delayed sleep phase syndrome. They can't really sleep until late at night. They tend to be up late at night, and then they prefer to sleep later in the morning. Partially, this is because of developmental changes. Again, the way that we sleep changes over our lifetime. Partially also, it's maybe related to, again, that the eye devices, the blue light. We'll talk about those. And what it really means is that frequently they just don't get enough sleep. So what does this mean for kids going to school and for young adults going to school? Well, the Centers for Disease Control has found in their own studies that one of the reasons that adolescents don't get enough sleep is also related to school times. 69% of high school students in the US, for example, only sleep 7 hours a night, which is not very much. And 2 in 5 only sleep 6 hours a night. However, 93% of our high schools and 83% of our middle schools begin before 8:30 in the morning. Considering that many children and teens have that shift of their sleep where they tend to be up late at night and want to sleep earlier in the morning, that creates a lot of difficulties. As a result, the American Academy of Pediatrics has recommended that middle and high school schools in the US should begin after 8:30 in the morning or later, but most of them don't. So there's now a great big movement called Start School Later, and here's some information about it, pushing to have high schools and middle schools start later in the morning. Even a half-hour delayed start can make an enormous difference in terms of health, academic health, mental health, and also success. So, okay, I've been picking on the iTab. I've picked on the iPad, the iPhone, Apple, it's not personal. I'll pick on Blackberries if they still exist. So what's wrong with it? Well, think about this one. Children 8 to 12 in the US can spend up to 6 hours a day in front of a screen. And that's a study by the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Teens can spend up to 9 hours a day. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that we should have them avoid exposure at least 1 hour before bed, but we know that isn't really the case more often than not. And the reason why this is important is that the light from devices, it's got kind of a certain wavelength called blue light. It actually affects your levels of melatonin more than any other wavelength does. It fools the brain into thinking it's time to be alert, it's daytime, it's time to get up and going. And what that does is it actually makes it more difficult for people to fall asleep. And over time, that constant exposure to the blue light even changes how your body's internal clock sets when you should produce melatonin. So you're basically creating the conditions to make sleep difficult over the long term. Here's just a quick chart to show you what I mean. So in a young group of people between 18 and 30 years old, when they're exposed to 3 hours of that kind of blue light from a device in the evening, this is their suppression of melatonin, meaning if you want to get to sleep, you need melatonin to rise, not to disappear. The blue light tends to lead to suppression of melatonin, and you see on that left here that I'm circling, those are people who are going to have much more difficult time falling asleep. They also end up reporting that they're much less sleepy after a few hours of blue light exposure. So you can see the effect there. Now, for once, I have good news about getting older. It's the only time we get good news about getting older. As you get older, you're less sensitive to that blue light. You actually don't find that you are less sleepy when you've been exposed to the blue light from your device, and your melatonin doesn't change as much. So, finally, some good news about getting to be 50 or over. So why aren't our heroes, why are our loved ones not sleeping? A lot of reasons why. There are parasomnias, things like sleepwalking, bedwetting, nightmares, night terrors. Some bruxism, teeth grinding is something people commonly report. Even sleep-related eating disorders. Some people find that they fall asleep and then they get very hungry and they go and they eat. Also medical reasons, asthma, allergies, ear infections, epilepsy and seizures, and we'll talk a little bit about that afterwards. Sleep disorders like obstructive sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, insomnia, and also mental health. Stress and anxiety can really keep people from sleeping, as we all know. Environmental factors, light, our exposure to light greatly influences our ability to fall asleep, especially as we are in the younger years. 6 to 8-year-olds are incredibly sensitive to blue light. It really suppresses their melatonin much more. It can take them sometimes even 2 hours longer to fall asleep than it might otherwise. Noise from traffic, TV. I lived in Manhattan for years. It was impossible to sleep without noise. Bed sharing, which is very common in families. Room temperature. If a room is too hot, it actually makes it very difficult to fall asleep because your body temperature needs to drop to a certain amount for you to fall into restful sleep. And then you might wonder, well, then how do I know? How do I know if I have a sleep disorder or a loved one has a sleep disorder? And one of the things we can do is something called the Bears assessment, where you're looking at a series of things. B for bedtime problems. E for excessive sleepiness. Do you find yourself drowsy during the day? A for awakening. Do you find that you're being woken up or that your loved one wakes up often throughout the night? R, regularity of sleep. How many hours does somebody get per sleep? And we'll talk about keeping a sleep diary and how that gives you a picture of how someone sleeps across the course of a week. Snoring. So many people will hear snoring or hear someone who suddenly stops breathing and then snorts. I can insist when my spouse says that, absolutely not true, but that's something that we look out for also. And you can see here in the screening algorithm that depending on what age your loved one is or you are, there are different things that you can look out for. This one has toddlers and school-age children and adolescents, but you can extend the information for adolescents out into adulthood. And there again, you're looking at people who are having problems falling asleep, problems staying in bed, feeling sleepy during the day, yawning a lot, having difficulty concentrating during the day, waking up a lot during the night, having trouble getting back to sleep. Many people report that they wake up and then they just cannot get back to sleep. And sounds of snoring or gasping for air. And one of the things that's most helpful to do is to keep a sleep diary, because one night of sleep can be very different than the other. And so what's most important sometimes is to get a sense of how someone is sleeping over the course, for example, of a week. So for example, in this one, on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so forth, you can keep track of what time you or a loved one went to sleep or a child woke up, how many hours during the day that they were awake, and even things that might influence your ability to sleep. How much caffeine, how much exercise, or was it done at what time of day? Things that might really give us a better picture of whether someone really does have a sleep disorder, to be concerned about. And so, we mentioned seizures, and often parents will say, parents of children I know I've worked with, I can't tell, are they just very restless sleepers, or could this be a seizure? And one of the things we always keep in mind is that anything that seems like it's recurrent, it's stereotyped, it happens the same way over and over again, and seems unusual, it may be a manifestation of a seizure. It doesn't necessarily mean it is, but it may be. And they're often easily confused with sleep terrors just because of the kind of repetitive movement that an adult or child will have. They tend to be more common in the first 2 hours of sleep, or sometimes in those early morning awakenings. And this brings us back to that circadian rhythm, that sleep-wake cycle that we talked about. They tend to be more common in kids than adults. And one thing I would say is, when in doubt, consult your MD, your GP, your physician, your pediatrician, your neurologist, your psychiatrist. Always consult your physician if you're concerned. They can do any number of things. Polysomnography, the PSG, it's a sleep study, basically an overnight sleep study. Though now these can be done at home. There are all these new headbands that can now be used. They allow you to do some of this in the home as opposed to, let's say, in a hospital or a sleep lab. And they help us determine whether there's sleep-related breathing or movement disorders, whether someone has sleep apnea or restless leg syndrome. They can help diagnose some of the nocturnal epilepsies or the parasomnias that we talked about. We can also use actigraphy. And you see the lady in the picture sleeping with what looks like a wristwatch. That helps us, gives us more information about how someone sleeps and wakes over the course of 24 hours or over the course of a week. We can keep sleep logs just to get a sense of the pattern of sleep. But again, always see your MD and ask for a referral to a sleep specialist. So with that, okay, what do we do about these treatments? Well, it depends on what's causing your sleep disorder for your child or your loved one or for you. If it's an underlying medical issue, then it could be medication, it could be CPAP. Many of us have A loved one who wears the continuous positive airway pressure mask that allows them to sleep throughout the night without apnea and without gagging and breathing for air. Surgery for some people. Chronotherapy, light therapy for people who have disorders where that timing is off. There are ways of using light as a therapy to help them sleep more efficiently. Kids are tricky because there are no FDA approved medical treatments, at least for sleep with kids. Meds for generally can work for adults, for example, but they don't work quite as well and they have side effects. Brings us back to melatonin. Melatonin is not FDA approved for anyone for sleep. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't really promote sleep itself. It promotes the quiet, wakeful state that promotes sleep. So, and we don't have a lot of long-term data. We don't really know with melatonin, what happens to someone who's been using it for ages. We just don't know. There's probably the most effective thing we can do right now is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI. It's shown to be the most effective thing. I can give you more information about that. And for many of our sleep disorders, we can do more immediate things also, sleep hygiene and behavioral treatments. And by sleep hygiene, what we mean is altering the behaviors that take place around bedtime. The sleep parameters for any of us, they're not set in stone. We can modify how we get into bed, when we get into bed. We can establish, regular bedtimes that help us get into bed at the right time. We respond well to routines. Sensory input and behaviors are incredibly important. We'll talk about those. Maintaining a regular sleep-wake schedule whenever possible. One of the best things we can do to help someone sleep better is to try and maintain a more regular schedule. Erratic schedules, which I myself am very guilty of, asleep at 10 p.m. one night, 1 in the morning the next night, midnight the next day, makes it very difficult for the body to get into a rhythm and the brain to get into good rhythm to promote good sleep. Importantly, trying to avoid napping later in the day after 3 p.m. and for older adults, for any adult really, and for children, and to trying to limit the nap to less than an hour when possible. Importantly, avoiding stimulating bedtime activities. Oftentimes we get into a pattern where we try to ramp up to sleep instead of ramping down. And I've worked with many families where someone will say, for example, the only way my son will get to sleep is if he bounces on the ball and runs around and jumps on the bed for 45 minutes until he collapses exhausted. Unfortunately, that's not really going to be great sleep. Remember, we talked about those stages and cycles of sleep that we go through. We want to help our kids and our loved ones ramp down to sleep for a more successful sleep. So really maximizing more relaxing activities in the evening and before bed. Bathing, softer, lower tones of music, dimming the lights a bit, creating the ambiance for sleep. Using grounding sensory input, deep pressure, weighted blankets, rolling a ball over someone, gentle rocking for some of our very young kids and infants. Turning off the media, trying to avoid the devices an hour before bed and none in the bed. There's a great quote about the bed. The bed is for sleep and for Ducky or Whoopi, and not for anything else. And that's important because we don't want a brain that now thinks it's bedtime, time to be awake. We want a brain that thinks it's bedtime, time to slow down and go to sleep. Reading bedtime stories for younger children using a softer, calmer voice. Keeping the bedroom dark and cool. High temperatures can inhibit sleep. Restricting caffeine and sugar a few hours before bedtime. Importantly, we tend, unfortunately, sometimes to think of, it's evening time, I gotta get ready to bed, what do I do? The important thing is to think of sleep as a process and what we can do during the day to promote better sleep at night. Encouraging exposure to light and sun during the day helps to set those hormonal and chemical and internal clock rhythms that help reset us so that we can sleep well at night and be active during the day. And extremely important, physical activity and exercise. Again, what we do during the day may most determine whether we sleep at night. Same for parents, for us, for adults. Be consistent, try to go to bed at the same time each night. Try to get up at the same time each morning, including on weekends. We've always had that idea. I'll pull all-nighters during the week, in college, and sleep all during the weekend. It turns out it doesn't really help as much as we think it does. It doesn't quite work that way. Try to keep, again, the bedroom dark and quiet and relaxing and more comfortable temperature. This is a tough one, but try to remove the devices from the bedroom a bit. Avoid large meals and caffeine and even alcohol right before bedtime. And again, exercise, being physically active during the day is one of the best things you can do to help sleep. What else can we do beyond that? Well, there's more specific things. Bedtime fading. This is where we move our bedtime or a loved one's bedtime to the time when one is actually drowsy. The worst thing we can do is to have someone in bed awake thinking, I can't sleep, I can't sleep, I can't sleep. Sleep restriction. And this is, again, when we shorten the amount of time that someone spends in their bed awake. Officially, I would say seek professional guidance. Unofficially, you can sort of, this is something you can do kind of with your own observations of your loved one as well. You can keep a sleep diary like we showed before to get some sense of how long someone is spending in their bed awake before they're falling asleep. And one rule of thumb in a way is if you find yourself in bed awake and you cannot fall asleep for more than 15 minutes, move to somewhere else. Come back to bed when you're drowsy. Create the conditions where your brain says bed is for sleep. Stimulus control, again, trying to remove all the very stimulating, exciting things from your bedroom right before you go to bed. Relaxation and mindfulness techniques does wonders, not only for young children and young adults, but also for all of us. And again, the really key point is we want smoother transitions to sleep. Many of our loved ones with neurodevelopmental disorders, they need help with transitions. We tend to sometimes say, okay, 9 p.m., time to go to sleep. That doesn't help necessarily. It's more helpful to give prompts and reminders. In 10 minutes, it'll be time to get ready for bed. Think of this time to get ready for bed, not in 10 minutes, you have to be asleep. We have to think of sleep more as a process. It's not a destination by itself. It's also a voyage to the destination. Set up the environment, set up the expectations, set up good conditions that allow us to sleep during the day, set up more physical activity. And I know I keep harping on physical activity, and I'm almost done, I promise. Just in case if anyone's fallen asleep, time to wake up. What do we mean by physical activity? And again, this is just any body movement that requires energy expenditure. It's movement during leisure time, getting to and from places. Exercise is just physical activity that you do in a more structured way. It can be anything: walking, cycling, for kids who are mobility impaired, wheeling, sport, active recreation, play. And what we find is that moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity tends to have the biggest influence on health, but that regular physical activity of almost any intensity can help prevent and manage a vast range of diseases from, again, from heart disease to diabetes, but also can have a gigantic influence on sleep. The more we move, the better we sleep. Even low to moderate activity improves sleep. Moderate aerobic activity can increase the amount of that slow wave sleep that we talked about, where you're really consolidating your memories and putting them all together. It tends to improve our cognition, our attention, our focus, our memory. This is so important for our young ones. Many of our young ones are in therapy. If you really want a therapy session to be more impactful, help your loved one be more active the day before and get a good night's sleep. That's when you'll really sometimes see a great burst of activity as a result of our therapies. And this could be yoga, for example. It could be any kind of movement. We'll see improved academic achievement very often, improved well-being, decreased anxiety, improved mobility. How do we get this? It doesn't have to be in the gym. You can go for a walk, a bike, a run. A lot of activities at home are give you a moderate amount of activity. Household chores, taking the stairs, playing, raking leaves. I live in Canada now, so shoveling snow we have 10 months a year of that. Brisk walking, and more vigorous things, jumping, dancing. All these things give us more opportunities to set the conditions for better sleep and better health. And you might say to me, but my child's in therapy, or my teenager's in therapy. Doesn't that count? Unfortunately not. It can, but some often doesn't, because many rehabilitation programs for loved ones, they're based on skills. They don't really give enough intensity or repetition throughout the week to get the benefits of physical activity. And unfortunately, they don't often have a cardiovascular component. They're not aerobic enough. And then they also may limit social engagement. It's important to be able to do these things also with others. So there are lots of opportunities at home in the community. It's really all about moving. And I would say physical activity is free, physical therapy is not. Now, please forget I said that, because you'll put me out of business as a physical therapist. But it's important to realize that we have opportunities. There are important resources. The National Center on Health, Physical Activity and Disability, for one, has a wonderful YouTube page, and you can see is that they have these great videos also with exercise routines and wonderful resources to help maximize physical activity throughout the day for our loved ones and of all age ranges. There's also, and this is included in the information for this, the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans. It's a PDF you can download for free. It has really great activity suggestions as well, and how you can maximize physical activity. How often? Well, if you want to improve sleep, at least 30 minutes a day of moderate aerobic activity would make all the difference in the world. Best maybe to do it less than an hour and a half before bedtime, because that can sometimes actually prevent you from sleeping a bit. But even one bout of physical activity one day can have an enormous influence on your performance the next day. But the more you do it, the better the result. Same with depression, anxiety, mood disorders. That moderate intensity, 20, 35% of your maximal heart rate can really have a giant influence on those. Even low intensity for some of our persons who are mobility impaired, there's a great deal you can do, from yoga to low impact movement, that will have these great benefits. And what else? And and how much should we get? Well, it depends on your age. For most of it's about we should get a few 3 hours a week or so. Most of us don't. But what about our persons with disability or loved ones? At least 60 minutes a day, 3 days a week is recommended. And that, again, it's a lot, but it's important to limit that sedentary time, to limit that recreational screen time. The more active we are, the better, and the more we'll see better sleep, better cognition, better everything. I really appreciate your listening to this. And again, sorry to put you all to sleep if I have. If I can pass on any information of any kind, I'm delighted to. This is my email. I'm happy to pass on resources, and please send me any questions that you might have. And thank you very much for your attention.
We just have a couple really quick questions, actually, because most of the questions that are asked in here are actually addressed in the attachments. So under his presentation, there's 4 attachments. Wonderful information in there. So check it out. You can print them out and everything. So definitely check those out. So one, which I want to know too, do blue light blocking glasses actually work?
So the jury's out. The idea is great, but I actually just saw a study that didn't find a difference. But the idea is great. Sometimes the problem is that that something is relatively new, and we need that big study to make sure it works. So I unfortunately don't have a good answer. But in theory, they should work. But I don't have the evidence. I haven't seen the evidence for them working yet.
Okay. Does melatonin supplementation affect natural melatonin production?
Again, believe it or not, the jury is out. And that's one of the reasons why I say that melatonin is tricky, because we don't know what happens to someone who's taking melatonin over the long haul. We just don't have the research for it. So we don't know. That's one of the reasons why it's sometimes so important to try and think, what can we do to influence sleep, not just to do melatonin supplementation, because we don't know if it'll have an impact over time. And to be honest, oftentimes that sleep hygiene, those sleep behaviors, we can do a much more sometimes to improve sleep than we might realize, and not rely necessarily just on melatonin supplementation. There's no evidence of a problem right now, but we just don't know.
Okay, great. Can you recommend a wearable device, preferably one that will not draw his attention?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a wearable device to track sleep, if that's the question, there are like, for instance, actigraph, because one of the problems, of course, like with some of the Fitbits, is that they light up, and the last thing you want is someone you're trying to track their sleep and they light up. I'm not sure if that's the wearable device you mean. If you yeah, they're made specifically so that they keep you, the wearer, from attracting attention to it, and they kind of blend in, so they keep other people's attention from it as well. But actigraph is one. There are any number of ones. Whoever that is, email me, and I'm happy to send you more specific information.
Great. I'll do one more because we're running a little bit behind. What about the use of essential oils to promote sleep?
Yeah, actually, and again, what you're doing is that you're creating associations. For example, and there's studies actually that have used essential oil even to see if it improves memory, believe it or not, that you have someone learn something with, for example, with a smell that they recognize, like lavender or rose, and then afterwards you give it to them again while they're trying to see if they remember things. But the same with sleep. What you're doing is you're creating a relaxing environment, something that's relaxing, that's soothing, that you associate with, oh, this makes me feel good, this makes me feel relaxed. It's very helpful. It's part of that setting the stage. And again, that's why I say sleep isn't a destination. It's not like you accelerate to 60 miles an hour and hit the brakes and say, sleep. You want to sort of slow down, and those essential oils can be very helpful that way. And I have to apologize. I know I ran over it. My sincerest apologies to the person after me. I tend to get excited and you can't shut me up.
Would it be a conference if anybody didn't? It wouldn't be a conference if that.
Right. And once I start yammering on, you just can't stop me. So my apologies. But yes, essential oils is helpful in that sense.
Great. Thank you so much. Any questions that weren't answered by Dr. Paez right now, they will be given to him to answer and then put back on the app. Just, all questions in the app are like that. If you put it on there, we don't get to it. That's how we're going to deal with that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.